Thanks, everyone. We have quite an impressive panel today, experts representing all areas of Government of Canada. So let me just dive right into it. So maybe, I think I'll start with you, Stephen. I think the Treasury Board Secretary has been very active in helping departments setting the direction around the guardrails of the responsible use of data in general. So I wanted to turn to you. Perhaps you can start with giving us a context of what's happening in the Government of Canada and the role that you play as the Chief Data Officer for the GC.
Thanks, Erica, and bon matin tout le monde. Very happy to be here today. Let me know if the microphone is talking about this. The microphone's too far, too close, and I'll try not to make too much noise up here. So look, Steve Burt from Treasury Board, been doing this job for a couple of years now. I think before I go too far in terms of what Treasury Board's doing, maybe just a little bit of inside baseball in case it's not obvious for some of you. Mark Sean, who we heard from earlier today, coming from our Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, are the folks responsible for regulating the industry, doing all the legislative base and the regulatory work that affects many of you, both on a private sector and academic perspective. Treasury Board's role is really much more inside government, right? We are the manager of government, whether that's HR or finance or technology, and we set rules inside government for how departments and agencies are actually going to deliver and the kinds of policies and directives that they all have to follow. So that's the role that we play within my team, which is the Data and Digital Policy Group of the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board. And what I would say in terms of the theme of the conference here, or the theme of the panel on building stronger digital government, we're quite fortunate in the Government of Canada context to be building on 6-7 years now of chief data officers and data shops being sort of proliferated across departments and agencies. I can't take any credit for it. It started happening when I was doing other things in government, but we have stood up since about the 2015 timeframe a number of big shops across departments and agencies that have actually begun to work through data governance, ethical issues, the sort of what it is where we need to put safeguards and where we can take a little more risk. So we've done a lot of the thinking that particularly in the last 12 months, as generative AI has really come to the fore, have really stood us in good stead in terms of that evolution. Because at the end of the day, AI is just the next iteration, generative AI in particular, of the flow that we see that starts with business intelligence and dashboards and things like that, all the way through more advanced analytic techniques to predictive analytics into AI. Right? A little bit closer. All right. The methodologies that go behind it, the issues that arise from it are very similar from one thing to another. So we are building from a position of strength, I think, across and relative maturity compared to other areas where we've been a bit behind the 8 ball as technical issues have emerged. So we started from the Treasury Board Secretariat perspective in about the 2018 timeframe of really building out guidance and directives on automation, we called it. We took a fairly neutral term on it, and the focus was really on decision-making, things that are going to affect citizens and other members of the public that will actually change how decisions are being made, or could potentially change how decisions are being made. So in 2020, based on that work, a directive on automated decision-making was set out for all departments and agencies. Anywhere where there was an administrative decision being made that we were going to automate some part of it, whether with AI or some other kind of process, there were a number of requirements in there that basically addressed 3 core issues. One, data bias. Have you done your due diligence to make sure that the data sets you're drawing on have been examined through the lens of bias? 2, algorithmic transparency, and a core piece of that directive is the algorithmic impact assessment, so we can get away from black box algorithms. We need to be able to explain what it is we're doing and how the decision was made. So for every program since 2020 that brings in automation for some form of decision making, there is a requirement to publish an algorithmic impact assessment, and there's a website where you can find those. The third piece that we thought was really important and needed to enforce in the automation space was recourse. If you don't like the decision that's been made that has affected you, you need to have some legitimate and effective way of going back and making sure that you can have it revisited. So what is the hook within whatever program it happens to be for citizens and other members of the public to do that? When we published that directive in 2020, our ambition was to revisit it every 6 months, which was bananas. Not to put too fine a point on it. The technology was moving fast, but not that fast, and our governance processes were certainly not moving that fast. So we made heroic efforts. In the end, we've just completed the 3rd revision, which is still, from a government perspective, pretty good in terms of how often you review your policy suite. So the 3rd revision of that directive was issued this spring, and we let ourselves off the hook a little bit to say we're going to update it every 2 years now. So we spent at least a year seeing it in operation, and then we'll make the tweaks we need to. So that most recent change did a couple of major things, but I think the big one was it also turned the directive on internal services, because previously it had been entirely public-facing services, but now HR, finance, and things we're doing internally are also subject to the directive. The other piece of work that we've put out in the last little while that applies to all governments and agencies is a guidance on generative AI. We watched this coming like a freight train starting about last fall, had a little bit of a debate about whether it was different enough to actually require its own guidance. In the end, we adopted a bit of a halfway house. We didn't set it as a formal policy piece like the Directive on Automated Decision Making, but we clarified that if you're using generative AI to make decisions, the directive still applies. And we set out in about 12 pages a number of things that people should think about whether they use generative AI for anything. Our goal on this one, because it is moving so fast, is that, so that was issued in September. We will have another iteration of that probably around the end of the calendar year. It's being worked right now, and we will have another one probably sometime by next summer. So I think the main thing I've learned, I came out of the sort of foreign defense policy world, where the acme of policy skill was you set a policy that you never had to change. It was going to endure for your entire career. This does not work in the digital space. So the iteration element has been the key piece for us, and making sure that we have the right methods in place to be able to update more or less constantly as these things do change. So I think the only other point I would make before I hand over here is that the major issue when you look at what Mark does and what we do from a Treasury Board perspective is that the regulation piece obviously has to fit a wide variety of folks across the country. Government doesn't have the luxury of just serving the lucrative middle, right? We can't design products that are only going to address the core of the 80% of citizens. Our stuff has to address everyone. So the issues around ethics, the issues around what kind of tools and channels you use are heightened by that. And that, I think, is where I would like to maybe pass over to Ema to talk a little bit about what ESDC does.
No, thank you, Stephen. You framed it very well. From an ESDC perspective, we touch every Canadian, from cradle to grave. So your point about not leaving anybody behind is extremely, extremely important. And the way we look at data and AI within my department is a way that's very intentional. So when I say intentional, we want to make sure that the base we use, the database we use, the foundation we use is representative of every Canadian across the country. And when I say this in terms of regardless of where they live. So if they live in the rural areas, urban areas, Indigenous communities, reserve, we need to make sure that they're representative. So when we talk about AI and scaling AI and models, the key points you raised about data ethics is extremely important. We've seen study after study that shows that things like natural language processing does not treat language the same. And we're a bilingual country. So we're a bilingual country, and our values is really, as a public service, making sure that we can serve Canadians in their official language. So one of the things we've seen is it is important to be very intentional around the use of things like natural language processing, because we've seen that as we treat Francophone text, it's very different. So the guardrails we have in place within ESDC includes the setup of a whole AI governance, and that entails having a data ethics team. We have a data ethics team that looks at the representativeness of our population before data is trained into models. We also do impact assessment. So when I say impact assessment, it's things like saying, okay, so if we're deploying a particular model into production, what is the potential impact on the most vulnerable in our society? Many of us talk about AI, we talk about AI, but we don't talk about some of the values, the Canadian values that need to be integrated into AI, and things like the Privacy Act. Is extremely important to every Canadian. People want to know what you're doing with their information. There's an expectation for transparency. So a lot of the tools that Stephen talked about, ESDC has applied it. So for example, we put a model into production in 2020, not long after the directive was out. And you can actually go and read everything we did in the Open Government portal. And that model we put into production was really weeding through people's applications for employment insurance. We had humans in the loop, as the previous speaker spoke about, and we also made sure we looked at things like data drift, because data shifts and it changes as you go. So one of the important things was also to consider those changes. The other important context within ESDC is the program context. So depending on the program we deliver, you need to understand some of the nuances behind those programs. So we work very closely with our program counterparts to make sure that before we deploy models into production, we're actually bringing in the business context, the nuance of the populations that we're supposed to be serving, and some of the key considerations around the methodological aspect. Another thing we do within my department is we work very closely with Statistics Canada. Many of you saw the release of the latest numbers of our population. We've hit 40 million. And from a demographic perspective, we see that our population is aging. We see immigration numbers have gone up, which is leading to the fueling our growth in our population. And the key question for us is, as we deploy some of these models into production, what could be the potential impact on the different populations that we should be serving that are currently underserved? And are there ways, for us to use AI for good to accelerate serving people who are underserved today? So a lot of our focus has been really looking at more intentional ways of leveraging AI for good, and also using AI to look at some of the systemic issues, that have come up through the years. So things like, in terms of how we serve people across the country, are we serving them equitably, or are they issues? And can we really use AI, leverage AI tools to serve people better? And there are ways to do this. We've seen that there are actual ways we can do this better. The other piece connected to what Stephen said that we've really taken an intentional look at is really looking at things like data curation. There's a lot of focus on really scaling AI, but we've learned that we have a lot of legacy systems. A lot of the systems we use in my department are older than me. So part of the thing is for us to be able to make sure that the data is cohesive and coherent, there's a lot of work needed to really make sure that that data is integrated in a way that's reflective of the policy intent of the program. So a lot of focus is also put in place in my team in making sure that the base, the foundational base of the data makes sense and is properly governed. The right people are accessing that data. We're making sure that as we really create anything, it could be a model, it could be an innovative methodological technique with data linkage, we're incorporating some of the core values of the public service around data privacy, making sure that security is taken into key consideration, and also making sure we're following the legislative context in which those programs were created. So I've said a lot, and I'll pause here and I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Thanks, Stephen and Emma. What a fantastic way to open. So we talked a little bit about the evolution of the GC approach to automated decision-making and AI. I think we've really honed in on what are some of the practices that's been put in place to ensure that there's an ethical and responsible approach to AI. We also want to look at the other side, which is the innovation that AI brings and the good that AI can bring to our clients and the people that we serve. So I want to pass it over to Steve. I know that your department has been exploring extensively in the use of these innovative technologies. So maybe I'll invite you to share a little bit of that with the audience.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and pleasure to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about a tool that we developed called AgGPT, which is a chatbot, very similar to ChatGPT, but goes back to dealing with just agricultural programs and services. So we have to go back about a year to November of 2022. The AI landscape is very, very different than what it is now. ChatGPT is not really on the scene, and tools like it aren't widely available to the public. Meanwhile, my department was involved in something called the Public Service Data Challenge. So if you're not familiar with that, it was a year-long competition that was open to public servants from all departments to suggest ideas on how you could use data in really innovative and creative ways. And so my team at AFC that works in AI was involved in this competition. But again, like I said, ChatGPT is not really around at the time, so we're kind of dealing with this kind of idea of, well, how do we make things more findable, how accessible, how can we get information into people's hands about the different programs and services that are out there? And we kind of played around a little bit. We had a few sessions where we got folks together in hackathons. So we had folks from our policy teams, our program teams. We had industry experts join us. We had students from Algonquin College's AI program. And we brought everybody together for a day for a hackathon where we thought, okay, let's try to unpack this problem and figure out if there's a way that we can solve it. And so we sort of landed on essentially a glorified Google search bar that would kind of help you find the services that you were looking for. And we were fortunate enough that that was enough to get us through to the final four of this data challenge. But at the same time now, ChatGPT is out and we're thinking, okay, generative AI is interesting. It certainly has some advantages that we just don't have right now with the search bar approach that we took. How can we leverage that technology and try to find interesting ways that we can use it? So we started playing around, and we kind of went back to the drawing board and built a new tool that is able to answer sort of questions about any of these different programs and services that are out there. And again, you know, we had another hackathon where we brought folks in again to play around and try to experiment with it, try to break the tool. And it was important to just get those different viewpoints as we built it. The other thing that we tried to do as well was to balance it with an ethical approach, because we took that very, very seriously. I think on the tech side, you know, we have a lot of really smart people that can build these tools. But we also have to take a step back and look at, is it, you know, when we're building them, we need to take other things into account. So we did the algorithmic impact assessment that was spoken about earlier. We also tried to work very closely with our folks in the diversity, equity, and inclusion team within Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada from the start, so that they were involved in the design of this tool. It wasn't something that we did at the end to check a box. It was really important to us that they were involved in the design. So we were able to build this tool, and fast forward to this past June, and we're fortunate to win the data challenge, which was really excellent for us in two ways. One, obviously, it gave us a mandate to go forward with this tool and try to put it into production. But I think the other thing, too, is that it gave us a bit of a platform at the GC level to try to influence the way that these tools are built. You know, I think it's really important going forward that when we build these types of generative AI chatbots. We're doing it in a very similar way for a few different reasons. One, I think just from a user's perspective, it's very confusing if every department were to have their own sort of approach to this. So I think that there's a lot of value in if we took a common approach so that the users get the same experience regardless of whether they go to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada or any other department. And then I think there's also that responsibility piece. I know that there's, the directive on automated decision-making, doesn't strictly speaking apply to something like a chatbot. But we took the position that any department that is providing information by a chatbot, it's certainly reasonable that someone getting that information could make their decision based on the information that was provided to them. And so we went the extra step to say, look, we need to follow the directive. We need to make sure that we're doing more than just the minimum in these things, because the stakes are so much higher when you work in the Government of Canada. Obviously for something like an agricultural chatbot, if it points you in the wrong direction, it's really not the end of the world. But you can see a situation where if you're asking for immigration advice, employment advice, anything of serious consequence, the standard of care is so much higher, and you need to be so careful about it. So I guess the big thing I'd like to leave here is that it is possible to innovate, to be creative, but to also balance that with taking a responsible and ethical approach to these types of projects. And I think we've done that. So we've kind of caught lightning in a bottle with this, and now we're working on a few other things.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing what you've seen and what your department has done so far. I think maybe I'll share a little bit about my perspective. So I work in Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, where the core of our mission is really making decisions about people's lives. So when it comes to automated decision making, and we've been on this journey along with other colleagues here for many years, we really wanted to make sure that transparency and the use of unbiased data and also the ethical approaches to how we curate the data, how we process the data, and how we communicate these decisions out, and also offering recourse is at the core of any approach that we use to automate anything in the services that we do. So that being said, I really like what you've said, Emma, around your approach of building up that data ethics team, looking at the whole representation of data across the board, ensuring that we are looking at the data-driven aspect of things. And I really appreciate your sharing your experience, and Steve, in starting small, take on a challenge and exploration kind of approach, learn from that, and then see if there's a way to kind of scale up. So we're on a very similar journey. We're at the early exploration stage, but we really see how these kind of innovative approaches to data science, whether it's AI or whatever the next wave may be, could bring some improvements into whether how we process our case, how we process the applications, or how we really connect with the clients in a more human and a more effective way. So I would like to invite the audience, we have a few minutes left, so to submit their questions. I have a couple already, so I'm going to start with the first question. And so this question is regarding the ethical issues that we're facing in AI today. So perhaps the question is, I'd like to hear the panel unpack what they see as the biggest ethical issue we need to put our attention to today. So perhaps I'll turn it to you, Emma, first, and then we'll invite others to it.
So in my view, I think we sometimes get carried away with the excitement of technology, and the most important thing is to make sure that we're integrating Canadian values, the values of the organization, in whatever technology we're using. So today, everybody's excited about Gen AI and AI. Tomorrow, to be something else. So what should be consistent, and I think you talked about this, Erica, when you talked about your work in immigration, is to remember the humanity and the impact around what we're doing. So in terms of the biggest concern for me, especially where I sit now, is to make sure that whatever I'm doing with AI or data and methodologies, advanced methods, it's really connected to that vision of building a stronger and inclusive Canada, because that's the vision of my organization. And when I think of the ethical issues, I think of things like, we cannot leave anybody out. So how do we intentionally leverage data in a way that can scale, and ensure that we're really driving to the policy intent of whatever policy we've made in terms of how we're leveraging those tools? How do we make sure that we are implying and not creating mistrust with Canadians by our use of some of these technologies, because we're not clearly discussing some of the issues? To your point, at the end, there are a lot of strengths in the use of these tools, but there are a lot of caveats around the tools. So how can we clearly communicate and balance this risk in a way that people understand and don't get scared of the technology and stop using it because of this fear? So to me, I think it would be important and imperative for us to have transparent conversations about some of the ethical issues to make sure that people are data literate, not just data experts or AI experts, but the entire population needs to really drive to a higher level of data literacy to understand the caveats, the issues, the considerations, and some of the key elements that will impact everybody as we use some of these tools.
You must, Stephen.
Yeah, I think at the scale of government, the one that I keep circling back to is the tension between accessibility and efficiency. I think that we, for a lot of our programs and services, we know we could be more efficient in terms of resource use if we were to be more digital first, but the accessibility is a primary consideration, right? We need to find a way to make sure that we are able to capture efficiencies while at the same time serving everyone. And accessibility, big and small, whether it's ranging from whether there happens to be an accessibility issue because of a physical or mental disability, or whether it is an accessibility issue because of a bandwidth problem, depending on where in the country you are. So I think finding the right way to actually frame that so you can make good decisions is a major challenge that we haven't really come to grips with.
Steve, would you like to add anything?
Sure, yeah. I think the other piece that I'd like to highlight is just there's an education component, I think, that really needs to be stressed here. I think that you don't need to be a computer programmer or an AI developer to be working in AI. It's everywhere. You finish your emails now, it's prevalent right across the organization. And I think with that comes a need to really educate people about what this is and how it works. You don't have to know down to the code level how it's working, but you should have a general understanding of how AI is doing the work that it does. And I think that's going to be really important going forward to just dispel some of the myths around it, but also just provide that education and allow people to take a critical lens when they're looking at anything generated by AI. It's almost like a media literacy component that needs to be kind of baked in.
Thank you. So the next question is for Stephen. So given the current pace of government, how can we count on our government to really keep pace? And what is needed to ensure that we don't fall behind?
I feel like someone was listening in when you and I were chatting in the back there. So I think this is a major preoccupation, right? Like I think as the technology evolves by leaps and bounds, and as Emma said, a year from now we might be talking about something completely different that we don't see even on the horizon yet. I'm concerned about government's decision-making processes and culture to some extent, but there's an interaction between those two things, obviously. Whether it's within department around basic governance decisions on how you run your day-to-day business, that can involve a lot of players, and we have a cultural tendency to default to more rather than fewer, which makes for more extended conversations and more flags being raised as you go through decision gates. All the way up to, frankly, our legislative and regulatory processes. Not to in any way denigrate the hallowed halls of the parliamentary system, which has a long and cherished history. It's not very fast, right? Like passing laws takes a long time. And my colleague Mark was talking about C-27. From the time that bill was introduced to the time that bill actually is put into force, a lot of things are going to have changed in what they're trying to regulate. So how do we do that better while preserving the importance of the institution and the democratic principles that it serves? I don't have an answer for that, just to be clear. So if anyone does, I'd like to hear from you. But that is, I think, the major challenge that we're facing is those sometimes very old analog systems for making decisions versus the pace of technology change.
Thank you, Stephen. Ima and Steve, is there anything you'd like to add? It's a big question.
I think Steve did a great job.
All eyes on Steve. No, this is great. So we have the next question. The next question is related to the use of ChatGPT in our department. So the question is, do you register and log the use of ChatGPT in our department? And what is important on tracking its use? So perhaps we'll start with Steve on this one.
Sure. I mean, I think there's been some guidance issued around how generative AI should be used, certainly by public servants anyway. I think at a very basic level, you don't want to be putting any commercially sensitive or proprietary information, any protected information, anything that's beyond sort of unclassified information into ChatGPT. In practice, does it happen? I'm sure it does, but I think that's where the education component really is going to be important, letting people know what's acceptable use for something like a ChatGPT. And remind you, I want to stress, it's not just ChatGPT. We're talking about any sort of these AI systems, and even Google Translate. I mean, you throw any information into there, and it's going to a Google server. So that's the education component that I spoke about, that we really need to do a good job of just raising the bar on that, so folks know what they can and can't do with it.
Over to you, Stephen.
So I don't think we need to be logging every use of it. I don't think we can log every use of it, right? I do think that the importance of a training and education program, a values and ethics code, sort of those, some kind of guidance on what the risks might be that you may not otherwise have thought of, is important. There's no way to control what people are doing at the level of individual desk officers and workers across the system. We need to find a way to enhance sort of the human accountability aspects of it and make sure that someone's actually responsible for the decisions that have impact. But having a bit of a frame around what's impactful and what is perhaps an area where you can take more risk, I think is the key piece for that.
Thank you, Stephen.
No, I totally agree. Within my department, we've actually rolled out a data ethics module that goes through exactly what you said, Stephen, like in terms of saying, these are the guardrails, these are things you should be careful of, just so that people are aware, because I think the awareness piece is key.
Thank you. And a little bit of a perspective from my department as well. Absolutely, I think you're bang on, Stephen, when you said we really need to be holding humans accountable. And a part of it is making them aware of the implications of decisions they make by perhaps implicitly using the tool in a harmful way. So that's where data literacy is coming into place. On IRCC, we're launching our first departmental data literacy program for the first time. It's launching by the end of the year. I'm very excited about that. A part of it is around teaching and really making people aware that the tools are available, but it's really human. It's you that's making that decision. That's at the end of that mouse pressing the button to say yes or no. So around that, I think that coupled with having the guardrails that's already available, issued by the TVS just not too long ago, coupled with that little bit of a spirit around innovation, getting the good, but respecting that there's things that we don't know, there's things that we need to be cautious with, and coupled with, again, having a literate workforce and giving people that kind of training, the tools, and making people aware that just because it's out there doesn't necessarily mean you should be 100% counting on it. ChatGPT, for an example, will give you false information. I think I ran an experiment of using a little bit of a recipe and it gave me something that was completely non-eatable, right? So you can't trust it 100%. You need to introduce that human aspect into it. And it's really the human in front of the computer that's making that decision, first and foremost. I think that's time for us. I really wanted to thank my esteemed panelists here for your contribution and your insights and sharing with us, and our audience for for asking these really great questions. So thank you for having us here.